a special presentation of LLBN with archaeologists Dr. Lawrence Garrity and Dr. Doug Clark. Excavating the Bible.
Welcome to this edition of Excavating the Bible, What Archaeology Can Teach Us. This program is dedicated to exploring the contributions of Middle Eastern archaeology to our understanding of and appreciation for the Bible. I'm Doug Clark, Director of the Center for Near Eastern Archaeology at La Sierra University in Riverside, California, along with my co-host, Dr. Larry Garrity, President Emeritus of La Sierra and founding director of a project that all three of us work in. Mm-hmm. And today we will be talking about Petra, Part 1, the stone and iron ages stone and bronze and iron ages that might be found in Petra or around it. And to help us do that, Dr. Kent Bramlett, Assistant Professor of Archaeology and the History of Antiquity at La Sierra University. We all have our Petra stories, and we had Petra stories before Petra was voted one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. Well, of the world, I guess, ancient and modern. Right. Stories of Petra. Now, maybe for some people, the music of Indiana Jones is already beginning to kind of throb. But what stories? Maybe your first time, Larry, when were you there?
Well, I grew up in the Middle East, and so my parents took me there when I was 13 years old for the first time. And my job was to get out of the car and move the stones away so that we could make progress. And it took us 3 days to drive from Amman to Petra. This is in 1953. Yeah, so it was very exciting to a teenager to get to visit.
This is the preface.
This is the preface. And in those days, there were no hotels anywhere, so we stayed at a tent camp, Nazal's camp, inside the ancient city of Petra.
I think we will even have a satellite view that would allow us to see Nazal's camp, or at least the modern edition of Nazal's camp. My first time was my very first year in the Middle East, 1973. And a pastor friend of mine and I hiked in on a Friday evening off of the work week at Hespan. Hiked in, it was a full moon. Wow. So we didn't need any light to help us get, even though that's a dark channel, the Seek, the crevice that we go through. And in those days, there was no ticket booth, there was no gate, there was no fence. We wanted to sleep in this huge tomb called the Treasury, El Khazna. And we did. I've got pictures of my sleeping bag there. And we had a devotional. We wanted to read something that captured the splendor of Petra. And so we sat down in the moonlight right out in front of the treasury, and we read from Isaiah 40, that grand creation-themed chapter about the God, the great God, and the nations are like a drop from the bucket, and God calls the stars out by name. We read that by the moonlight. That was tremendously memorable. Yeah. Your first trip there? Or maybe that wasn't the most memorable one.
Well, I don't go back before the days of the tickets, but at least they only cost $5 when I first went in. I've had some interesting experiences climbing. What I like to do, climb the 5 high points in a day, which is a challenge. I did go in by moonlight one time, but it's getting harder and harder to do nowadays.
Right. Well, lots of ambient light making it more challenging, but you can't get in because they closed the gate. And I've not tried to follow you, Kent, on all of these, the 5 hike days that you're trying to do, the high places, the various high places. But that is a lot of walking, a lot of hiking, a lot of moving, and a lot of water that you have to drink. It's hot in the summertime.
Yeah, it is. Yeah.
So what then is important about Petra in antiquity? We can think about the time periods represented then, we will, but maybe to capture something of the feel of Petra, maybe the poem of the poet from the middle of the 19th century, John Bergen, who won a Newdigate Prize in 1845 with this poem, and we only have parts of it here. But it's such a marvelous and well-written piece. I'm just going to read the lines that we have on the screen. It seems no work of man's creative hand, and that's that's what Petra surrounds you with, a sense that this is more than human. There's something more than humankind behind it. By labor wrought, as wavering fancy planned, but from the rock, as if by magic grown, eternal, silent, beautiful, alone. And then there should be an ellipsis there, and down to the end of the poem. But rose red as if the blush of dawn that first beheld them were not yet withdrawn, the hues of youth upon a brow of woe, which man deemed old 2,000 years ago. Match me such marvels save in eastern clime, a rose-red city half as old as time. It's a tremendous poem, and it captures, I think, this sense of mystery. Now, it's 19th century romantic sort of ways of describing things, and there were lots of travelers in the 19th century, but not until someone discovered it in the early part of the 19th century. Johann Burckhardt, Swiss traveler, who actually made himself out to be Muslim in order to get in. Because it had been off limits for the Western world for, what, 900 years, right. Almost 1,000 years. And in 1812, his book is absolutely engrossing to read, because he's finding his way through Petra, and then as the sun is setting, he still wants to get to the high place. He's heard about the high place. And as the sun is setting, the guy who's with him finds it, and they get to it, and he's able to see it the last day he's there. It's a marvelous book to read. But it's the rediscovery for the Western world of Petra.
And we probably should say, for people who maybe didn't know much about Petra, that it is in Jordan, isn't it? In the modern country of Jordan. And probably the best known archaeological site, certainly in the country.
Very much so. And all of the money that comes in from tourism, a lot of the money that comes in for tourism goes there. Yeah. That reminds me, too, what you were saying, Larry, that what we want to do with Petra, which does resonate with some people, certainly popularly, but not with everybody, and not with the kind of information that's archaeological that we're looking at, or biblical. But that we are dedicating 5 sessions, 5 editions of this program to Petra, so that we can look at different time periods and how they're represented here, and get a good feel for it, and make these biblical connections as we go along. So. The history of Petra. Kent, there looks like a lot of archaeological language here, time periods. Talk to us about these different periods. We will come and we'll look at some of them in this edition of Excavating the Bible. Others we'll save for later.
Well, the first period represented, actually not in Petra proper, but on the outskirts, is the Neolithic village of Beta. And the Neolithic is a very pivotal period when plants and animals are beginning to be domesticated, and they're growing their own wheat rather than just harvesting the wild crops nearby.
And why is it called Neolithic?
New Stone Age.
New Stone Age.
Right.
So that must mean there's something else. It's following on other Stone Ages. I mean, when was the division made? Stone, then metal, and then political, because you have Stone Age, Old Stone Age, Middle, New, Neo.
It's actually by Thompson, Danish curator of the museum.
Right.
In the early 19th century.
Early 19th century. And then you move to bronze, iron, and then you move to political.
Right, political dynasties, empires.
Right. So we're at the end of what was called the Stone Age.
Yeah.
And you were talking about the importance because of domestication of animals and plants, villages starting to grow. What else can we know about that?
Well, yeah, once you can supply the steady supply of food, then you can settle down permanently and have a larger community as well. And then all the other things that come with that, the arts and the crafts and
and one of the things that's important to archaeologists is that this is when pottery is invented, right? Because in the Neolithic period, you have a period before pottery, and then during that period, pottery is invented, and from then on, it becomes sort of the backbone to our way of dating our finds.
It Kent would be out of a job if they had
without the
not
pottery.
invented pottery, because that's what you do. You're looking at this pottery, attempting to determine age, and then you associate that with whatever else is found in a layer or against a wall or something like that. So this invention was very important. The notion of settling down and crops and so on, if you're a shepherd only, you don't have to stay in a place for long at all.
Just follow your animals around while they're eating their food.
Right. Once you plant annual grains and vegetables and so on, you've got to stick around at least to protect that for a few months. Once you start planting vineyards, you're talking years. If you plant an olive orchard, you're talking a generation. And so these settlements and the domestication of agriculture are developing hand in hand. I know that's not an easy and just a quick and simple sort of development, but there are those associations. You don't need to stay in a tent any longer. You build a permanent house.
And there are downsides too. I mean, it's not as easy to withdraw to the back, the hills, the back valleys, when hostilities present themselves.
But because people start staying in the same place to watch their crops and so on, they tend to leave materials that we dig up because they continue to live at the same spot. And so their towns grow in the refuse, the debris that's left.
It's not easy to follow, 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 years later, Bedouin who are following sheep. They don't leave a lot. I mean, there are traces. In fact, with some of the sophisticated equipment these days, quite a bit can be known. But a settlement, there you have something that remains. So what would we have, if anything, that the Bible writers would think about or treat of a time period where this is happening, the beginning of pottery? Were they even interested in this kind of thing? Or was their story a grander story, a more important story, a different kind of story? Do we hear anything about the Stone Ages in the biblical record?
Well, we certainly hear about shepherds and the people who invented metal making and those kinds of things in Genesis. So it reflects, I think, an earlier period of time.
The idea of first metallurgy.
And with metallurgy in particular, the smelting of bronze, and, copper and bronze. And so then you move into the...
And the first cities.
First,
First musicians.
Right.
So maybe echoes of that past. Do you think the biblical writers thought of that as an ideal past or as a past we're glad we're not going back to? I mean, this is really a speculative kind of question, but what do you think? Did the biblical writers look favorably? Did they see traditions there that they wanted to maintain and somehow keep?
I think so, because as Kent says, they're talking about the first person who did this, the first one, and so forth. And so they do look back at a time that was very different from theirs, but they're building on the shoulders of the people who went before.
Well, an overview of Petra. Wadi Musa is the modern town meeting the stream, the dry stream bed of Moses. The Ain Musa, the spring of Moses, is located up at the beginning of the entrance down into the town. It's one of many springs of Moses. So either he was angry a lot and struck a lot of rocks, or people identified with Moses and identified with water and celebrated the value of Moses to their traditions. And so you have Wadi Musa, and then the entrance into Petra comes along here, and then this is Petra proper. Then there is what is called Sehun. That's a modern resettlement of the Bedouin tribe that was in here. The government did that in the mid-'80s. And then Beta is the place that we'll be going to, because as we look at three different periods, the Stone Ages, the Bronze Ages, and the Iron Ages, we can do that fairly quickly because there's not a lot from them in and around Petra. So we go to Beta first, and one gets to it. Petra is below the picture here to the south. One takes the road, comes in here. This is actually known as Little Petra. And we'll come back to that because there are remains here from Roman times that will be important to us, including some spectacular frescoes in the ceilings of some of the caves. But one walks around the roadway here, and now they have it newly designed with not mile markers, but time markers along here so that you get back to the time when this is dated. And so you have major events anywhere around the world, and then you get closer and closer to the time here in the 7th millennium BC, in the 6th millennium BC, to a little town of Beda. This is a settlement made of stone buildings. Kent, what sort of structures were these? And are these domestic? Are they public buildings? What kinds of things do we have going on here?
You can see the circular structures. Those are actually the earliest kind. And then there's more rectilinear, rectangular structures on a later level. Those circular buildings were fairly low. They were residential. People lived in them. But you can see, at least in one of them, you can see a little bit of post recessions or in the recesses in the wall where there were wood posts that supported probably a reed type of roof. But we would have to duck down to go in, and it wouldn't be large, wouldn't be a lot of living space.
Right. So would they spend a lot of time in their houses, or this is kind of the place you go after you've done everything else outside?
Pretty much, yeah.
Of the size. They actually have reconstructed several of these in ways that they feel best represents the archaeological finds. The reeds, the sort of the mud over the reeds, well, a central post, and then these beams that go out to the posts that you were talking about in the walls, and then reeds across there and plaster and so on the top. And from those impressions from the plaster that still survives, one can see how this is, can be reconstructed.
Right. And that
so they've actually done a lot of
same way of building persisted, didn't it? Obviously with changes, but remember in our work we've found the same kind of reeds, probably that they had earlier on, that was used as roofing, and posts that held it up and so on. So they utilized the materials that were in their environment to build.
They did, and they lasted quite well.
They did.
The fact that this was covered over is what preserved the site, but now in recreating and restoring the buildings to what they must have looked like in antiquity, one really gets a feel for people. And Kent mentions having to bend over because he's so tall.
Right.
These doorways are really quite low, and you do have to bend over quite a bit before you get into them. So, the early, well, that was the late Stone Age, the New Stone Age. The Bronze Ages. There are Bronze Age sites near Petra, but not in Petra proper. Bronze Age, we're talking about 3,000, 3,300 BC, down to, what, 1,200 BC, 1,200, something like that.
So in other words, we're talking about the patriarchal period if you look at biblical times.
That's correct. So if one, and if you get to the end of that, you're getting into the time of Moses.
Right.
But the early Bronze Age, actually Middle Bronze, as we like to think about, maybe 2,200 to 15 or so, 100 BC. We think about the patriarchs and the matriarchs and the families and the tribes and so on. But we don't have much from these Bronze Ages. There are small settlements that have not been excavated. It's not been studied very well. Now, Kent, you are an expert. This is your area, the late Bronze Age. What, 1,500, 1,550 or so to 1,200? Anything in or around Petra that's connected with that time period?
I'm not aware of anything that's been excavated from that time period. Of course, local traditions have identified Mount Hor, where Aaron passed away, where he died. It's called Jebel Harun, and there's a shrine on top of Jebel Harun. Of course, it's just the tallest mountain in the area, as traditions typically affix themselves to the high places around.
So at least tied to a story that would be a late Bronze Age story.
Right.
And we do have late Bronze Age remains elsewhere in Jordan, of course, including at our own site where we've been excavating. It's just that right here we don't seem to find it.
There seems to be a fairly significant gap, certainly in Petra particularly. But then if we get to the Old Testament period and we start thinking about a mountain that was in the previous picture, you saw the aerial, but this is the side view from the east. This is what mountain?
The Arabs call it Biara today, is that right?
Which means mother
of cisterns.
Right. So one should then expect, going to this site, that there would be a lot of water preservation, conservation facilities of some kind, cisterns, channels, that kind of thing, and we do see those.
And right on that flat top is where they did collect the water, and where we find archaeological remains from Old Testament times.
In
right
fact,
there we're looking at it.
we can see it here, and one can see archaeologists always leave these piles of dirt where they've been working. But here's where the excavations took place. When did these happen? Larry?
Yeah, it was in the 70s and early 80s. And Crystal Bennett, a British archaeologist who was trained by Kathleen Kenyon, excavated here. And she was a friend of the royal family, so she talked King Hussein into giving her a helicopter that took her up there every morning and picked her up in the evening to bring her home. So unlike the rest of us who have to climb up those difficult rocks, she got delivered there by a helicopter for her work.
Crystal Bennett excavated a lot of material in southern Jordan.
She did.
A lot of sites. Did she do Tawilan
She did,
as well?
yeah. Right.
Which is just to the north of Wadi Musa. So it's very near. Also from the same time period, we'll get to that in a minute. And Busera, or
one of the Edomite capitals.
One of the Edomite capitals. And so she excavated several, a British person of some presence, right? I mean, she had, people knew when Crystal Bennett was there, and she carried herself. And she contributed significantly to our understanding of southern Jordan and to what we would now connect to Edom, or the Edomites. So has made some serious contributions.
In fact, at Tawilan, I think she found a cuneiform text that is very rare to find in Jordan, but it goes back to Old Testament times.
Right. Okay, so some other photos here using these flat stones, which almost stack up like bricks. And so here are some housing units. There are some others, doorways. Probably
I think most of her evidence was 7th and 8th century BC.
Correct. Let's make sure we talk about the time period. And it seems that is what, at least how she identified the time period through most of the Edomite territory, was 7th and 8th.
Right. Of course, we know there were people there earlier.
Yes.
Back to the Late Bronze Age, the Egyptians mentioned these nomadic peoples that lived in.
And they called them these are the Shasu.
Shasu.
And so we've got people moving around, probably not leaving a lot in terms of
material culture.
But then the settlements is where Crystal Bennett was excavating. And so we have this.
And the Edomites are known for their acro sites, these mountaintop sort of fortress redoubts where they could pull back to in times of danger.
Which will come in handy as we think about a biblical connection here momentarily. Incidentally, the site. Is this Selah? Some people would argue that it is in the Old Testament.
It's been argued.
Others would say that Selah should belong to the modern acro site, high site, called Selah.
So, just a little bit to the north.
Yeah. So there are these different arguments. Is it always this hard to identify sites? That, we read about them in the Bible. People should know where they were. So why are people having a hard time?
Isn't Selah another word for rock? I mean,
it is.
So that there are many rocks.
Well, Petra is just a translation to Greek. Yeah.
That's right, in Greek. Yeah.
So yeah, it could be any of these acro distinctive sites.
And when you travel in this area, I mean, there are these sandstone hills all over the place, which are in many ways impregnable, except they really weren't at the end of the day. But they certainly seemed like it in the process.
The slide you have up there now illustrates why the Arabs call it the mother of cisterns, because there are all these cisterns where they're catching water and feeding it to storage water.
And rainfall here is somewhere near 100, maybe 150 millimeters a year. It's not much more. You get up to the hills to the east and you get a bit more, but in Petra. And so you collect all the rainwater you can, and so these channels are just cut on the open face of the rock outcropping and headed downhill toward these cisterns, which some of them held 20, 30,000 gallons of water. So yes, why not call it what it really has become, at least in Arab times. I don't know how far back that name goes. It doesn't go all the way back to biblical times.
No.
So whether we're thinking of
the
Sinai or
Nabateans, who we know best from this area, were known for their expertise in preserving water and getting water, collecting it and keeping it and so on. They were really good at it.
And when we turn to that segment, to that edition of Excavating the Bible with the Nabateans, the next one, we'll watch and we'll see how that has developed and how successful they were at doing that very thing. Well, this is text, and maybe on some television screens it will be fairly small. So Larry, I think you need to read this. It comes from a prophet, the prophet Obadiah. A lot of people think that Obadiah would be a good book to read because it's only one chapter long, one of these prophetic books, the shortest one. But it's directed against the Edomites, who think because they're high on these promontories that they're safe.
Yeah. And maybe just before I read that, let me also say that there is that biblical story in Kings that is repeated in Chronicles that talks about Amaziah, the Israelite king, who throws 10,000 Edomites off the cliff. And so there are biblical connections when you get down into the divided monarchy. But anyway, Obadiah says, "Thus said my Lord God concerning Edom, I will make you least among the nations. You shall be most despised. Your arrogant heart has seduced you, you who dwell in the clefts of the rock, in your lofty abode. You think in your heart, who can pull me down to earth? Should you nest as high as the eagle, and your nest be set among the stars? Even from there I will pull you down, declares the Lord," in Obadiah 1-4.
Reading that, standing on El Beata, or standing below El Beata, all of a sudden the significance of these words are really become important. The Edomites were singled out by the prophets as really problematic, in part because during the Babylonian conquest of Judah in the 6th century BC, the destruction of the temple and of the city of Jerusalem, the Edomites, at least according to some of the biblical passages, came through kind of like a vacuum cleaner and swept up the remaining spoils. And from then on, well, we talk about the Esau, Jacob stories before that, but certainly from then on, the prophets had nothing good to say about them. Well, I want to thank you, Kent and Larry, as we've talked about this, and all of you for joining us for this edition of Excavating the Bible. We hope that this has added something for your mind and something for your soul. And we look forward to next time. Until then, think ancient, keep believing, and keep exploring. For Excavating the Bible, I'm Doug Clark.